Hello and welcome back. I'm very thankful you're here today. This is Jennifer McGuire and I'm really excited about today's video. Now I will be sharing offset inking techniques with stamps, stencils, and dies. But more importantly, I'm going to be using two very special stamp sets that I'm really thrilled about. So I have lots of examples for you, and I'm going to start with the stamping, then the technique for the background, and then we'll put some cards together. Let's first look at the two stamp sets that I'm excited about. The first one is from the Stamping Village, and it's called We Stand With You. The Stamping Village is a group of stamp companies that work together, and they keep growing. Well, they once in a while come out with stamp sets that have designs from the different companies all together on one. So the theme of this stamp set is unity or togetherness or standing together. And 100% of the profits will be donated. I really like the encouragement sentiments on this that are great for making cards for any of your neighbors and friends and family. Now I wanted to show you the different companies included on here, and so you can kind of see each area of the stamp set is a different company. At the top there we have Lawn Fawn, then we have Dare to be Artsy, Studio Katia, Hero Arts, which has a lot of fun little different people there. Then we have Picket Fence Studio. On the bottom there is Altenew. This is Gina K Designs, Pinkfresh Studio, Concord and Ninth, Avriel, LDRS Creative, and then the last one at the top right is Pink and Maine. Okay, the other stamp set that I'll feature today is one that I am just over the moon about, and this is Hero Arts United as One. Hero Arts designed this stamp set along with my friends Dana and Pam, and I will link to their blogs below because you really should check them out. Dana and Pam are Black crafters who are working really hard with Hero Arts to make this industry more diverse and inclusive. So let me read to you what they have to say about this set because I think it's really well said. So Dana, Pam, and Hero Arts are excited to partner in a conscious effort to be intentionally diverse and inclusive. Crafters and card makers of all color need to feel support, appreciation, and respect when expressing their values, experiences, and skin tone in their work. We are celebrating the spirit through unity, and this collaboration is a pathway for everyone to see themselves in their art. We hope this United as One stamp set will encourage makers to become interested and committed to listening and learning from and about each other and recognize we are all one united creative community. 100% of the net profits from this stamp set will go to racial justice charities. So this stamp set is just the beginning of a unity collection that Hero Arts is doing with Dana and Pam, and there will be images that will really inspire everyone. So this stamp set I think is really wonderful to create encouragement cards to our friends of color, but also just to anyone who could possibly need it. And you'll see that as we're creating these cards. This stamp set features the layered images to build the holding hands. Now, I decided to spend quite a bit of time going through all of my inks to try to create different skin tones, and I wanted to share those with you. I used a combination of Hero Arts ink, Gina K Designs, Altenew, and Pinkfresh Studio. So you can see the little abbreviations before the ink color name. I thought it would be helpful to come up with all these different skin tones so that when I create a card for someone, I can have one of the hands look like mine and the other hand look like theirs, and it makes the card even more personal and special. So there are some different combinations if that's helpful to you, and I'll be using these different color combinations throughout this video. Next, I wanted to show you how to use these stamps. Now that you've kind of seen the different combinations, I wanted to show you how easy they are to layer. Keep in mind that the stamp set has an outline if you prefer to color them with Copic markers or watercolor or whatever. But I'm going to be using the layering images today. So there are two layers for each hand. I'm going to make one hand, like this one here, look like me, and the other hand look like the person I'm giving the card to. For me, for my light skin tone, I start with the Gina K Barely There ink and double stamp it. For the first layer, the other hand here, this one I did the Sand Dunes from Altenew. That was a little too light, so I went ahead and double stamped that too. I noticed that I don't have many skin tone inks in my collection, so I found that it was helpful to sometimes double or triple stamp something to make it darker or be more true to what I was going for. After I did the first layer of both hands, I come in with a slightly darker ink for the second layer. So I went ahead and made a bunch of these hands in different skin tones, and I have them ready to go. Next, let's create the backgrounds, and this is the technique that I wanted to feature today, and I call it offset inking. For this technique, you can use stamps, stencils, or dyes, and I'm going to show you all three. All you need is white pigment ink. Okay, so let's start with a background stamp. This is a Hero Arts Leafy stamp. It's a fantastic image, and I have it in my Hero Arts MISTI stamping tool. I'm inking up that stamp with Hero Arts Unicorn White Pigment Ink. Any white pigment ink would work. I really like the Unicorn White because it's bright white, nice and juicy, and I seem to get really good results with it. After stamping that, I clean off my stamp, and watch, I'm going to move the paper up just a little bit in my MISTI stamping tool. I shifted it up maybe 1/8 of an inch, not much at all. You can shift it as much as you want, but with a stamp like this, I think a small amount is best. Next, I'm inking up the same stamp with a dye ink. I chose Hero Arts Tide Pool ink because it's slightly darker than the cardstock that I use. I stamp that, and what happens is some of this stamped image that we just did with the pool ink lands on top of our white stamping, and some lands right next to it. So it looks like you use multiple colors, not just the two, but multiples. So if you look closely, you end up with a light pool on where the ink landed on top of the white, and then a dark pool outline on one edge where it landed on the blue cardstock. And it gives this optical illusion. It looks like it's dimensional or embossed, but really it's perfectly smooth. It's such a unique and cool look. So let's do another example like that using another background stamp. By the way, you could do this with regular stamps. I just was going for backgrounds, so I chose background stamps. This time I'm using the Hero Arts Eucalyptus background stamp, and I'm stamping the image with the bright white pigment ink. Now, I decided to double stamp this to make it really white, but you don't have to if you don't want to. After I've cleaned my stamp, I'll also shift that cardstock up a tiny bit in my MISTI stamping tool. So just a little bit, again, about 1/8 of an inch or less. I'll put the magnet there to hold it in place, and even put a little piece of tape so it doesn't shift. This time I'm using Hero Arts Dye Ink in the emerald color because it kind of matches and is a little bit darker than the cardstock I used. And when I stamp that, I again get that really cool optical illusion look where it almost is like the white image has a bit of a shadow. So this is a great technique with any type of stamp. You can see this one is a thin lined image. The last one was a little more bold, but it's a great way to use that basic white pigment ink along with a stamp and a dye ink to get that shadowy look. Let's do another with a slight offset stamping. This is another Hero Arts background stamp. I've already stamped it with white pigment ink. Now I'm going to put my cardstock back in and shift it up a tiny bit and ink up my stamp with a navy ink and then stamp that. So again, we'll get that offset look, which will create that optical illusion of dimension. Now I'm using all Hero Arts cardstocks today, and for these backgrounds I used all Hero Arts dye inks, but any dye ink would work along with that white pigment ink. And look at that, isn't that awesome? Looks like it's got so much texture to it. I have another example with a background stamp, but this time instead of only slightly offsetting to get the layering, I will rotate the panel. I've already stamped the image with white pigment ink, and I'm putting a little bit of adhesive on the back. Now I'm putting the same piece of cardstock back into my MISTI stamping tool, and I'll ink the same stamp, this time with dye ink. This is Tide Pool Hero Arts ink, and I'll stamp it, and this will give me an overlapped new looking pattern. So sometimes you can stamp with white pigment ink and then rotate your piece or the stamp and stamp again with a dye ink and get that fun layered new look. Okay, let's next look at offset inking techniques with stencils. I find this technique to be fantastic with stencils because there are many ways you can do this. So I have a few examples. For this particular one, I'm using Hero Arts Sand cardstock, which is a craft cardstock, and the Hero Arts Diamond Stencil. I have a blender brush here that I use just for white pigment ink, and I'm dabbing it all over this stencil. You can go in a swirling motion, but I was afraid I would mess up the stencil. I didn't put temporary adhesive on the back, so by dabbing, I can get great results. So now I'll go clean off my stencil. I just run it under water and wipe it clean, and then I heat set my white pigment ink. I will line the stencil back up with the inking we already did. You could flip the stencil or rotate it and ink on top of it if you wanted, but I'm just going to line it right back up. Once I have it lined up, I will shift it a little bit, just like we shifted our stamping before. So there it's lined up. I'll give it a little bit of a shift and then tape it down in place. I did a very little offset. Now I'm coming in with a dye ink. So this is Hero Arts Ultra Pink, which is a nice bright ink. And I again will dab it on with a blending brush. You could use any inking tool here. And this is a really bright pink, but since it's landing mostly on white pigment ink, it'll look softer. So that's something to keep in mind also. So now I'll remove the stencil and look at that. It looks so cool. You see a little bit of the bright white still showing on one side of the pink. I thought I'd add to it. This time I'm lining up the stencil again, but shifting it a little bit in the other direction. So I've shifted it a little bit, and now I'm applying a dye ink. This is Lemon Yellow from Hero Arts over top. Where the pink and yellow overlap, will end up with an orange color. And look at that. You still see the white, but then you have the pink, the orange, and the yellow all showing through, and it gives a really cool look of texture once again, all using offset inking with a stencil. I always make sure, by the way, that I heat set these backgrounds before continuing because the pigment ink does stay wet for a while. My next example also uses offset inking with a stencil, but this time I go for a softer look. Now off screen, I have already inked over my stencil with white pigment ink on white cardstock. And that's already there, it's hard to see. Now I'm lining up the stencil in the same spot and then shifting it just a little bit, about 1/8 of an inch, and taping the stencil back down. Now it's time to apply dye ink, colorful dye ink on top. This time I'm using the new Pink and Main Ergonomic brush in the mini size. You've seen me use the large size for big backgrounds in the past. Well, I'm excited because they just came out with a mini version, and I find this is really easy on the hand. I like how this fits. My hand doesn't get as tired when I'm inking large areas, and I can get into smaller areas, unlike with the bigger ergonomic brush. So this is a small one. I only have one so far. They gave me one to try out, and I've already ordered a few more. But what I'm doing, once again, is dabbing color onto my stencil. Now you could swirl with this for sure, but I just want to make sure that I don't mess up the stencil pattern, so the dabbing really works just fine. Now I'm doing a few different colors here. I did Tide Pool, Cornflower, and the Fresh Lawn. Each time I do clean off my stencil before going back to the ink pad by just rubbing it onto a dry cloth. That's because sometimes when you do this technique, you pick up a little bit of the white pigment ink that's already on your paper, and that you don't want to transfer to your ink pad. So by just rubbing it off in between onto a dry cloth, you have no problem. After removing the stencil, you can see the beautiful results that you get with the white pigment ink underneath the dye ink. We slightly offset it so you see a little bit of bold color around it, but this is much softer because I used a softer amount of ink and because I used a detailed stencil. This almost looks suede-like. I like that you can get different looks using the offset inking technique. Let's do another one like that, this time on colored cardstock. For this one, I have already inked over the Abstract Wave stencil with white pigment ink. I heat set it. Now I'm lining the stencil up again, but shifting it a little bit upward. This time I did a little bit more of a shift because this pattern, I thought it would work. I'm once again using the Pink and Main Mini Ergonomic brush to apply the same colors of ink over the pattern of the stencil. I'm dabbing off onto a dry cloth in between to make sure I don't take any white pigment ink from the cardstock onto my ink pad. And when you remove the stencil, check that out. Such a soft, textured look. It's just beautiful. And the white pigment ink looks really cool on colored cardstock, and you see it more when you tilt in the light different ways. I wish it picked up in the video better. But this one is definitely one of my favorite backgrounds. As you can see, the offset inking works great with any type of stencil. Okay, now let's do offset inking with dyes. Yes, you can do this with dyes. All you need to do is create your own stamp from whatever dye you have. I do that with craft foam. I'm using the Hero Arts Flower Garden dye, one of my favorite background dyes, and I've cut it from craft foam. This has a little dimension to it and it die cuts beautifully. After I've die cut it, I'm putting a little bit of temporary adhesive here and there on the back. We just need a little bit so it stays in our MISTI or attaches to an acrylic block temporarily. Okay, so I've put my little pad there in the MISTI. I've laid my craft foam with the adhesive facing up. I close the door on the MISTI, and now we have our own stamp that we created from a die. Now this craft foam actually takes ink beautifully and stamps beautifully. So I'm inking it up with white pigment ink, and I'll stamp on some pool cardstock. Now what I forgot is craft foam is thinner than a clear stamp. So when I went to stamp it, it didn't completely stamp. That's because I forgot I need to add some shims underneath my mouse pad in my MISTI stamping tool. So I just have a few pieces of cardstock that I'll put in there just to raise up my cardstock so that I can stamp on it completely. So now I'll just put it back in the corner, ink up my stamp again with white pigment ink, and stamp it. So you'll need to put some shims in there, but if you stamp with an acrylic block, it'll stamp beautifully. Since my stamp is already inked up with white pigment ink, I decided to also stamp it on other pieces of cardstock, other colors, so I can have a bunch of backgrounds to make all at once. So after I was done with the white pigment ink, I used a baby wipe to try to remove as much of it as I could, and a dry cloth. Once it was clean, or as clean as I could get it, it's time to put my cardstock back into my MISTI, and I'll shift up the cardstock a little bit. Now this one I shifted quite a bit. You'll see it, I went up almost 1/4 inch. I've inked up my stamp with soft pool ink from Hero Arts, and I'll stamp that on top, and check that out. Super, super cool. So you can see this works great with dies even. Now here I have shifted up my cardstock a bit, this time a little less, and I'm inking up my stamp with Tide Pool ink, and I'll stamp that on top. Again, getting that wonderful offset look. If you want that color to be more intense or the offset look to be more intense, use a darker dye ink. This time I'll be using a cornflower blue ink, and I'll stamp that offset onto my lapis blue cardstock. So now I have a bunch of backgrounds I was able to create quickly and easily. Oh, and I did one on pink. This one ends up really bright. I stamped over it with raspberry jam, which is much darker, and look at that. It's almost magical how cool that ends up looking. All that look of dimension, but perfectly smooth. It's great for a one-layer card. Now that my backgrounds are complete, I'm going to go back to my stamped hands and finish those pieces off to add to the cards. I'll keep this very simple, and I'm not going to show all the steps because it's really easy to do. Some of my hands I kept holding face down like this, and some I kept up like the one on the top there. I used heart dies to cut several of them out because it fits in there perfectly. Now on this one I wanted to stamp a little sentiment onto the heart and make sure it's straight. So I have my little sticky mat, which I shared in my last video, and I'll link to it here if you'd missed it. And that will hold my heart in place in the middle of my MISTI here as I line up my stamp and ink it up. Since the heart doesn't really fit in the corner because it's not square, that sticky mat is helpful in holding it there while I make sure I stamp on it straight. On another one, I have this long strip that I cut with the hands at the top, and I have a few of the different sentiments from the United stamp set, and I'm using my Simon Says Stamp Grid Transparency to make sure I have all of the sentiments lined up evenly and centered. Then I can close the door on my MISTI to pick them up, and now I can stamp on it. That grid transparency is very handy to make sure you get things straight and even. Okay, so I have a bunch of different pieces, all a little bit different, all featuring those hands. To keep my video a little shorter, I decided not to show all of the assembly of these cards because it's really easy to do. I trimmed all of my inked backgrounds down and added them to a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch white note card. And then I added my hand pieces. To make these simple cards stand out a bit more, I did add little die cut hearts, which I covered with Tonic Aqua Shimmer Pen, so it had some shine. And then I put glossy accents on top of that, so it has a little sparkle, shine, and dimension. And I even used glossy accents on the fingernails of some of the hands. So let's look at all of the completed cards. So this is one of our offset inking stencil backgrounds. I added the heart die cut with the hands, and I even put a little ring on one of the fingers with a pen. I added a pop of color with that little die cut heart, and I white heat embossed I Stand With You on black cardstock. Such an encouraging sentiment. Okay, my next background is another of the stencil offset inked backgrounds. And this time I made the hands on a strip that is diagonal on the card. That We Are Better Together is from the Stamping Village stamp set. So I used a lot of those sentiments with the hands also. I used a black pen once again to draw a little bracelet and ring on the hands and add a little pink to the fingernails. So you can change these up, put tattoos on them, draw clothes on them, whatever you want. For this card with the inked stenciled background, I used the You Matter to Me, which I think is another one of the great sentiments from the Stamping Village stamp set. And you can see here the white, pink, and yellow inking that we did on the background. It's a really fast technique to do, and it creates a dynamite background for the simple card. The background on this one is another one of my favorites. This is the background that we created doing offset inking with our craft foam stamp that we created from a die. Love how soft it is. And then I added a heart die cut to the center there, added it with some dimensions so it would stand out, have a little pink heart on there, and then the perfect sentiment for that hand-holding image. This is one of my favorites, and I plan to mass produce these while I'm on vacation. This background is the same technique, but this time I had the hands facing up to kind of go with the I stand with you sentiment. I added some holographic cardstock hearts to this so it would catch the light nicely, and it also kind of matches that blue background. I like that holographic cardstock picks up whatever colors around it. For the next background, I decided to use the hands along with the You Matter to Me, but this time do it on a white cardstock rectangle along with a black mat around it. And then I added a simple heart right above the hands and some nail polish to one of the hands. Okay, next we have the one where I lined up the sentiments. Such an encouraging card also. And we have that background where we did offset stamping with the white pigment ink and the dark blue ink. Here's the first background that we made in this video where we did the offset stamping with the Leafy background stamp. I again used the We Are Better Together sentiment with a simple heart added to the hands. So think about all the different background stamps that you have that you can do this offset inking technique with to get a completely new look with the look of texture. And last but not least, we have our Eucalyptus background where we did the offset stamping. I love it on that dark color cardstock. And again, I used some holographic hearts just to create a little bit of something that would catch the light. Before we go, I wanted to share something special with you. Last week, I was part of the Pass the Brush art event over on Instagram. This was a 2-day event where a white artist passed the brush or passed their Instagram channel over to a black artist. This allowed these wonderful, talented women of color to have their voices amplified for more people to see their beautiful talent. And I am telling you, it was one of the most rewarding things I've ever done in my career. I was honored to pass the brush to a lovely human named Candace Hunter. She's now one of my very dear friends. We had so much fun. In fact, we created a live chat together where we created a card and she challenged me to make a card in under 7 items. Can you believe it? And we laughed so hard. So I encourage you to head over to my Instagram channel to check out what we had in store last week, and I will provide a link below in my YouTube description. Be sure to check it out. It was a really special event, and I think it'll make a big change in our industry. All right, there you have it. I have all the supplies that I use linked below in my YouTube description. I appreciate you watching. There's a couple other videos here in the middle, and I'll see you again soon with another video.